On the morning of February 28, 2026, the United States military began striking military and nuclear targets inside Iran, and no member of Congress voted for it. Not one. The operation, which President Donald Trump named Operation Epic Fury, was launched jointly with Israel, while most of the American public was asleep. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 18 million barrels of oil pass every single day, is now under direct threat of disruption, which means the cost of driving your car, heating your home, and buying groceries could change this week. And here is the question that the official record does not yet answer. If the administration knew for weeks that a bipartisan war powers resolution was scheduled for a Senate vote as early as next week, why did the strikes begin the night before that vote was set to be scheduled? And who made that timing decision? The history of this confrontation does not begin on February 28, 2026. It begins in June 2025, when the United States first struck 3 Iranian nuclear facilities in what the Pentagon called Operation Midnight Hammer. At that time, a July 2025 Pentagon assessment found Iran's nuclear program had been set back approximately 2 years. The official narrative after those June 2025 strikes was that military action had resolved the nuclear threat. The record shows something different, because by February 2026, the Trump administration was already assembling what Trump himself called a vast armada in the region, signaling the threat had not in fact been resolved. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, a member of both the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, had already filed a new bipartisan war powers resolution in early February 2026, a second one, precisely because the pressure continued to build. The question of who decided the timing of these new February 28 strikes and why had not been answered by the White House as of this recording. The law governing this moment has a name, a number, and a history. It is the War Powers Resolution of 1973, passed by Congress over the veto of President Richard Nixon, and it mandates that the President must consult with Congress prior to committing U.S. armed forces to hostilities, and must provide formal notification within 48 hours of any troop deployment into armed conflict. It also imposes a strict 60-day limit on any unauthorized military engagement. What actually happened on February 28, 2026, according to Senator Tim Kaine, who described it in an interview with NPR's Weekend Edition the same morning, was this: 0. The evidence suggests that the Secretary of State called the Speaker of the House, and that was it. We did not receive notice. That is not consultation. That is a phone call. And the gap between what the law requires and what the record shows is the central dispute now sitting before the United States Congress. The data documenting public opposition to this action is extensive, specific, and recent. A Quinnipiac University national poll released on January 14, 2026, found that 7 out of 10 American voters, 70%, do not want the United States to take military action against Iran. An Economist YouGov poll conducted between February 20 and 23, 2026, just 5 days before the strikes began, found that 49% of Americans somewhat or strongly oppose U.S. military force against Iran, compared to only 27% who support it. A University of Maryland Critical Issues poll found 49% opposition and only 21% in favor of initiating an attack. Earlier YouGov polling found that 85% of Americans surveyed said they do not want the United States to be at war with Iran, with only 5% saying they do. These are not fringe numbers. 70 to 85% of the American public, across multiple independent polling organizations, had placed themselves on record against this action before it began. And still the question of who set the timing of these strikes remains open. The contradiction is in his own words, and it is documented. On September 9, 2013, Donald Trump posted on what was then known as Twitter, "The president must get congressional approval before attacking Syria. Big mistake if he does not." That post is archived and independently verifiable across multiple news organizations, including NBC News and factcheck.org, which cited it in the context of Trump's own 2025 Iran strikes. The current documented reality, as confirmed by NPR, The Guardian, and CBS News on February 28, 2026, is that President Trump launched sustained military operations against a sovereign nation, Iran, without seeking or receiving any vote from Congress whatsoever. The Nonpartisan Project on Government Oversight, known as POGO, documented this same contradiction publicly on February 28, 2026, with its director David Janofsky stating, "The Constitution is clear. Congress has the sole authority to declare war." The president's announcement today that the U.S. has conducted military strikes in Iran without congressional approval is yet another flagrant abuse of power by this administration. That is not a partisan organization. That is a documented finding from a nonpartisan watchdog. And it raises directly the question of when, if ever, the timing decision for these strikes will be fully explained. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who serves as a senior member of the Senate Budget Committee and has sat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, is not simply a political opponent of these strikes. He is the author of specific, on-record legislation designed to prevent exactly this moment. On June 16, 2025, Senator Sanders introduced the No War Against Iran Act, a bill that would prohibit the use of federal funds for any military force against Iran, absent specific congressional authorization. In a statement accompanying that bill, Senator Sanders said, "Our founding fathers entrusted the power of war and peace exclusively to the people's elected representatives in Congress, and it is imperative that we make clear that the president has no authority to embark on another costly war without explicit authorization by Congress." By February 28, 2026, Sanders had publicly labeled the strikes illegal and unconstitutional, and the bill he had pre-positioned months earlier is now the legislative instrument through which that challenge will be tested. What the official record does not mention is whether the administration reviewed that legislation before selecting its strike timeline. The more unexpected voice in opposition to these strikes on February 28, 2026, was not a senator, not a progressive lawmaker, and not a Democratic leader. It was Tucker Carlson, the conservative media personality who has been one of the most prominent voices aligned with Trump's America First movement, and who had supported the president across multiple controversies. Carlson's opposition carries a specific weight here, precisely because it is politically inconvenient for him. On February 28, 2026, Carlson told ABC News journalist Jonathan Karl that the attack on Iran was absolutely disgusting and evil. Those were his words, on record, attributed directly to him by Karl, whose report was cited by ABC News, Barron's, and multiple other outlets. This is not a Democratic opposition voice. This is someone whose credibility with Trump's own base makes his condemnation politically significant, and whose reaction suggests the fractures inside the MAGA coalition over this decision may be more consequential than any congressional vote. And this is where it becomes personal for you. Within days, not weeks, oil prices are already moving. International benchmark Brent crude closed at a 7-month high of $72.87 per barrel on the Friday before the strikes, according to Global News. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies published a detailed analysis on February 18, 2026, mapping 4 disruption scenarios for global oil supply. Even their most conservative scenario, a disruption to Iranian crude shipments of 1.6 million barrels per day, projects a price increase of at least $10 to $12 per barrel in global crude oil markets. That translates directly to higher prices at gas stations across the United States within days of this recording. The medium-term consequence is less visible, but more consequential to your household. MarketWatch reported on February 28, 2026, that any chance of a Federal Reserve interest rate cut in 2026 is, in the words of their reporting, evaporating before our very eyes as Iran tensions raise oil prices. If the Fed does not cut rates, or is forced to raise them to combat oil-driven inflation, that means higher mortgage rates, higher credit card interest, and higher costs on every dollar of floating rate debt you carry. That is the connection between a military operation in the Persian Gulf and your monthly bank statement. The long-term scenario, as documented by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in their February 18, 2026 analysis, is more severe. If Iran retaliates by directly attacking Arab Gulf oil facilities, what CSIS labels Scenario 4, the analysis projects oil prices could exceed $130 per barrel, surpassing the historic spike that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Up to 18 million barrels per day of non-Iranian Gulf oil could be disrupted. And through all of this, the question of who decided to launch these strikes the night before Congress was scheduled to vote on a war powers resolution has still not been answered in any official statement from the White House. The documented record was reviewed, and the answer to the timing question is now available, though it does not resolve the constitutional question. It is a documented fact, confirmed by NPR, The Guardian, and CBS News, that the White House was aware of Senator Tim Kaine's bipartisan war powers resolution, co-sponsored with Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, which was scheduled for a vote in the Senate early the week of March 2, 2026. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called the Speaker of the House. He connected with 7 of the 8 members of the so-called Gang of 8, the bipartisan congressional intelligence leadership, by telephone, according to a U.S. official cited by NPR. The Armed Services Committees were notified only after the strikes had already begun. 3 documented explanations have been offered for this sequence of events. The first, articulated by Senator Tim Kaine in his NPR interview on February 28, 2026, is that the administration deliberately rushed the initiation of hostilities to preempt a congressional vote that might have limited or blocked the operation. The second explanation, offered by House Speaker Mike Johnson in his statement on February 28th, is that the administration had pursued every available diplomatic and peaceful solution, and the strikes were a necessary response to Iran's sustained nuclear ambitions, making speed operationally essential. The third explanation, advanced by Jonathan Turley in an AOL Fox News analysis published February 28, 2026, is that presidential war powers in this context have decades of executive branch precedent behind them, and that every administration since Nixon has stretched the war powers resolution without facing definitive legal consequence. All 3 explanations are on the public record. None of them has been definitively adjudicated. The question of whether this was strategic timing designed to outmaneuver a Democratic vote remains genuinely, documentably unresolved. This is documented. This is not opinion. On February 28, 2026, the United States government committed acts of war against a sovereign nation without a single congressional vote, while 70% of the American public was on record opposing that action, and while a bipartisan congressional resolution designed to prevent exactly this moment was days away from a scheduled vote. The specific question you should now be asking yourself is this: if the War Powers Resolution of 1973 has never once stopped a president from going to war unilaterally, and if the upcoming congressional vote is likely to fail, given Republican majority opposition to limiting Trump's authority, as a similar Venezuela measure failed earlier this year, what exactly is the mechanism by which the American public's constitutional right to have Congress decide questions of war and peace is enforced? Here is the comment question. Does a sitting president have the legitimate authority to launch a sustained military operation without congressional approval when the nation has not been attacked? Or does the War Powers Resolution of 1973 need to be replaced with something that actually has teeth? Leave your position below, because both sides of that argument have a genuine case to make. What you have just heard is documented in full by NPR, The Guardian, CBS News, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Quinnipiac University National Poll of January 14, 2026, Senator Sanders' official Senate press releases, and Senator Kaine's on-record NPR interview from the morning of February 28, 2026. The next story in this investigation examines what happens inside Congress in the days immediately following Operation Epic Fury, and whether the bipartisan war powers votes, now being forced by Kaine, Paul, Massey, and Khanna, will produce a historic precedent or collapse the way every prior attempt has collapsed. If you want to act on what you just learned, go directly to the official website of your own United States Senator and find their public statement on the Iran strikes, because their position, or their silence, is the most telling data point in this entire story.